Good evening, everyone. Agus Céad Míle Fáilte. You're all very welcome to the first in the National Archives online public lecture series for 2023. I'm Elizabeth McAvoy, and I'm the archivist with responsibility for education and outreach in the National Archives. And on behalf of the office, we're delighted to welcome you here tonight. Ditto our guest speaker, Michael Walsh, who will present on From Tithes to Griffiths, Property and Valuation Records. Almost 600 people have registered for tonight's talk. And to those who are tuning in from the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and many more countries, an extra special welcome to you all. Before we begin, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping details so that you can engage with our event. Audience cameras are off and mics are muted, but we actively encourage your participation in tonight's talk using the webinar's Q&A function. Michael's talk will run for roughly 50 minutes, with 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. And you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions during the talk. So please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the control panel, as we will not be monitoring the chat box for them. We'll accommodate as many questions as time permits. So apologies in advance if we don't get around to answering yours. We're recording tonight's talk and we'll make it available after the event on our YouTube channel, as we have done with all our talks for the past 2 years. And tonight's recording will be going up on our website over the next day or two. We'll also be live tweeting tonight's talk, so please like or retweet our posts at NAR Ireland. So a little bit about our speaker. So welcome to Michael there. Michael's lecture will introduce you to the key factors of the major land and property valuations in 19th century Ireland, many of which we hold here in the National Archives. And among the record collections he will cover will be the Tithe Applotment books, early townland and valuation notebooks compiled as part of the valuation process, Griffith's Valuation, revision books, and other information resources underpinning the valuations. As for our speaker tonight, Michael Walsh has been involved with genealogy for the past 2 decades. He's a member of Accredited Genealogists Ireland and is currently its vice president. Prior to his career in genealogy, he had a successful career in IT and now runs his own company, Family Lines, from his home in Westport, County Mayo. Family Lines concentrates on helping people who do not live in Ireland to do their own family history research by providing practical help on the ground in Ireland. And Michael's special interest is in tracing Irish families who have settled in North America and the UK. So, Michael, over to you.
Well, good evening, everybody. As Elizabeth has said, I'm a member of AGI, the accrediting body for Irish genealogy. I intend to talk about those systems of local taxation in Ireland that were based on land and property, the records they left behind, and their value to family historians today. So this is what I intend to cover. And I can't get my little thingy to work for some reason. Just I do apologize for this.
Take your time.
Move the slide. Right, we've got it. So what I'm going to cover is the tithe applotments, as Elizabeth had mentioned, methods of raising money for local expenditure that were based on property and land, and then look at the documents that underpin those, known as the valuation notebooks, and examine the evolution of the system from early valuations to a tenement-based valuation, which is better known as the Griffith valuation or the primary valuation, and how that was maintained. So let's start with the Tithe Applotment books. What was the tithe? Well, the tithe was a traditional way of supporting the church, and it derived really from early Christians, and indeed it has its roots in Judaism. The word itself meant a tenth. And so people were encouraged to give a tenth of their produce, agricultural produce that would be, to the support of the church and good local causes. Contributions typically were based on the produce of land. Now, over time, things changed, and increasingly in the early 19th century, tithes started to be paid in cash rather than kind. And legislation was introduced in 1923 to mandate the payment of tithes in cash. Now, in order for this to succeed, there had to be some form of valuation in order to calculate what everybody should pay. The tithe itself was based largely on the area and the quality of the land involved. So when we talk about tithe allotment books, what do we mean? These were essentially a set of handwritten documents compiled for each townland within a civil parish. They recorded who held land in that townland, the size of their holding, and the value. And the value itself was based on the price of wheat and oats over a previous period, typically of about 7 years. So how was it done? Well, valuers went out into the countryside and measured the area of townlands and plots, assessed the quality of the land, made notes about the crops that were grown, graded land according to quality, and then using an average price for standard agricultural products, calculated a tithe or a 10%. And this was done by civil parish. So what do the books themselves contain? Well, they contain valuation sheets, which were lists of landholders by townlands within diocese. And they showed the breakdown of the land into tithable and non-tithable land, and for tithable lands that could be subdivided into various quality categories. And there might have been some side notes as well. So the valuation sheets, which we have, which are dated from 1823 to 38, list the landholders in alphabetical order. They have the land area and the tithe payable, and they also record the distribution, that is, to whom the money went. Now, it wasn't as straightforward as giving it to the local church. Often bishops and the diocese, they wanted a cut. There were sometimes large landowners who'd given up their land for abbeys and monasteries and churches who felt that that should be recognized. And there were sometimes local organizations who were responsible for the physical upkeep of the church infrastructure. Where do we find these? Well, we find them here at the National Archives. And there is also an alternative source behind a paywall with Roots Ireland. So let's have a look at 2 sheets. I know this may not be very clear to you, but basically you can see here a valuation sheet from the townland of Drum Crow in the Diocese of Kilmore, and this is covering County Cavan. List of people in alphabetical order, and then in this particular one, the land has been divided into 3 quality zones, and associated with each is the area for each landholder. And the total acreage, And then in the section over on the right, it shows where the money goes. And in this case, it's split two ways. There's a dean's part, which would be the church, and there's also the earl's part, which would probably be the prominent landowner at the time. A footnote is that these acres were not the imperial or statute acres of the Griffiths valuation, or that we're familiar with. They are Irish acres, and they were typically 1.65 times a statute or imperial acre. So this did lead to a little bit of confusion. The second sheet I'm showing you is similar, list of landholders. And this talks about, in the third column, arable land. So here we're starting to distinguish between land which was producing very little and regarded as non-tithable. We're just concentrating on the tithable land and then dividing that, in this case, into two quality categories, each of which has a price. And using that price, we can then calculate the value. So there were limitations to this exercise, inevitably. So what were they? Well, of course, the information itself is limited. From a family historian point of view, all we have is a name, just the head of household, and a townland. More significantly, it covered agricultural land only, so urban dwellers in cities and towns across the country were excluded. Further problem was townland names themselves were not standardized until the 1830s. So as most of you will know, certainly those living in Ireland, townlands often have 3 or sometimes 4 different names. This was an age when most people could not read or write, and therefore surnames were spelled by documentalists, and inevitably mistakes were made. There was no standard format for recording these valuations. And so diocese decided what it wanted. In some cases, the individual parish did. And there were a large number of exclusions. The church itself, those various improprietors that I mentioned, people who owned the land and had made it available for the church and monasteries and so forth. And then exemptions, that might be for Church of Ireland land itself would be exempt. And of course, it only recorded a payment by those who actually leased or owned land. So for a large amount of the peasantry who were really moving from job to job in different areas, were much more mobile, they were not recorded. But why are they so important? Well, as most of you I'm sure will know, we lost here in Ireland all our census records from 1821 through to 1851. That was in the big fire in the basement of the civil courts in 1922 during the Civil War. They're important because they list the names and addresses of possibly half of the households of the country. They were the only survey that really showed where people lived, the land they occupied, and its value. And significantly, a lot of the tithe records predate church records. Now, many Church of Ireland records were destroyed in the fire that I mentioned in 1922. Many other churches didn't start keeping records until late in the 19th century. So in some cases, the tithe apartment books are the only records, written records available, particularly for lower classes who wouldn't appear in wills and testamentary records or in newspapers, etc. So the overall value to historians. Well, I think I should mention they are of limited value, but it's worth noting that there was strong opposition to the tithe system because it was a system for supporting a church which the majority of people in Ireland didn't belong to. So there was strong opposition from the Roman Catholic Church and from other Protestant dissenters, such as the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Methodists, and so on. And this campaign of resistance did actually lead to widespread refusal to pay. And the Church of Ireland responded by creating lists of those people who were in default, those people showing what they should have paid, what they haven't paid. And these lists became known as tithe defaulters lists. And 127 of these still survive. And they've got 29,000 names on them, covering 232 parishes, and they're held here in the National Archive. So that is a useful point to know if you're really looking for somebody who might just appear as a defaulter against the tithe allotment charges. So let's look at the early valuations. So far we've been dealing with the church records. Now we're going to turn to how we financed local government, local services. Essentially, the valuation system was marked by three significant pieces of legislation. And we're going to have a look at the consequences of that. The first two were based on the townland, but this evolved into a much more precise valuation where each plot of land in the country was valued, each tenement, each holding, and that the results of that were the primary valuations, otherwise known as the Griffith valuation. Now, local taxation, excuse me, there was widespread dissatisfaction with the system. The historic system of locals for paying for local services, such as roads and hospitals and jails and so forth, was administered in each county by a grand jury. And this would be made up of wealthy landowners and so on, very unrepresentative of local taxpayers. The money was raised to a tax on property, which we knew as the county rate or the county cess. And then various officials, the grand jury would meet in the assizes, maybe once or twice a year, determine what the budget was for the next year, accrued budget figure. And then officials would then work out what each individual should be paying. So those charges were apportioned or allotted against individuals. Now, there was no regulation of this system. Incorrect acreages, people were sometimes using historic acreages from hundreds of years ago in order to minimize their tax bill. There was great inequity about it, as some people were using measures that were clearly favored very wealthy people and led to disproportionate payments. So there's widespread injustice, inequity in the system. And of course, there was no appeals process. So Parliament decided that they needed to set up a number of parliamentary committees to look at it. The most effective was that led by Thomas Spring Rice. And this was a Kerry landowner who produced a seminal document. And from the work of that committee, 3 of the major state agencies are still functioning today that have their roots in his recommendations. Firstly, the committee said, look, if you're going to value things, we need to have a standard and agreed set of boundaries. So that we all agree what civil parish is, we all agree what a townland. We need to map those and give the maps to the people who are actually doing the valuation so that we have a uniform, verifiable and transparent way of doing it. So a boundary survey was established, I think it was 1825, and this determined the boundaries of baronies, civil parishes and townlands. And that was handed to the Ordnance Survey, who was a mapping aid, set up as a mapping agency, who determined 6-inch Ordnance Survey maps. And when they were complete and agreed, they handed those over to the valuers. And they stored those records in the valuation office. So those 3 agencies are still in existence today. Legislation was required to introduce this form of valuation. So it's based on townlands, that's not on individual plots or individual farms. There was exemptions for houses valued at under £3 a year. There was a standardized set of rules. Townlands were to be segregated by quality, and land was related to the local set of prices for primary produce. The valuations weren't published, but the working documents were what became known as the valuation notebooks, and they supported the system of townland valuation and were carried right through to the Griffith valuation. And these are actually stored here in the National Archives and are available to search online. And they're also available in the Northern Ireland, in Proley and Belfast. The Valuation Act of 1836 made a few changes. The threshold for inclusion was increased to £5. They started to focus more on farms within townlands. So this was marking a move towards more individual landholdings. But again, the field books, the house books, and the other valuation notebooks were used. Now, all this was suddenly overtaken by the Poor Law Union Act of 1838. Now, this established a system for the relief of the poor. This was moving into the very, very tragic famine times. The relief of the poor in each parish was the responsibility of these poor law unions. They had to establish a workhouse to look after, provide hospital treatment, provide some form of care, maybe some sort of job for people who were destitute. And this was to be funded by a poor rate. So now we have a series of poor law unions run by boards of guardians, quite separate from what had gone before. Inevitably, there was confusion. We actually had two systems, both based on property and land, but they were different systems raising different taxes for two different bodies to use for different purposes. So inevitably, there was confusion. But eventually, this subsided, and it was agreed that a single system of valuation would be used for both taxes, based on land and property, but based on including all land and all property. Would be an appeal system, and it would be maintained. And the results of this were the primary valuation, the Griffiths valuation. So, before we go on to the Griffiths itself, perhaps we can have a look at the valuation notebook. Now, there are a large number of notebooks, but I've just picked out 6, the most important of these. The field books, essentially, these notebooks were collections of working documents, and they were stitched into sets of books compiled by the surveyors and the valuers who actually went out across the country. And firstly, under the townland valuations we've talked about, and later under the Griffith valuation. So it's worth remembering that many of these books and the information that they have predate the Griffiths valuation. So if you're looking for something in Griffiths and it's not there, it is worth looking at these books, and you can do, as I said, online searches from the National Archives website. So the field books were really covering land. The idea was to work out how to value a piece of land based on its quality, based on the crops it was producing, and so forth. And some very qualitative descriptions were made in these notebooks. I'll just quote you one, and it says about a particular plot: good, sharp, rich soil on sharp, brown clay subsoil. So you're getting a nice kind of picture about what that particular plot of land was like. A rate per statute acre. So now we're talking about field prices, a means of calculating what the value of that land was using a standard rate. These were compiled by Townland and then later by Tenement, as we mentioned. There are over 7,000 of these books compiled, and they're invaluable to family historians. The house books, as the name implies, were about the building, largely in urban areas. Often recorded the occupier's name. Again, many of these predated the Griffiths, but they also included an assessment of the buildings in terms of how it was constructed, how new, how recent, how old it was, and they gave it a quality classification, going from A+ right down to C-, which was a pretty inhospitable dwelling. It measured the size of the building, calculated the area, divided that by 10 to arrive at a measure. And using a standard rate per measure, it was able to calculate a value. And there are over 4,000 of these still survive. The rent and tenure books, typically the rent books were about the rents that were paid, and this was useful if you were valuing something to know what the rent was currently, it was to derive an economic rent. The tenure or perambulation books, they were interestingly called perambulation books because that's what they did. The surveyors and the valuers perambulated across plots of land and made notes. They drew sketches, they made observations that I've just read out about the soil and so forth. So they were interesting comments, but they've also provided data about the type of lease, the type of rents, who the occupiers were, the leases, and any other observations that were considered relevant. And many of these as well have survived. Other books, mill books, are interesting because there were a large number of mills in the country, 4,000, doing various things from corn, textiles, paper. And because there were so many, it was important that there was consistency in the valuation of these mills. So a special effort was made to record details of mills across the country. The quarto books are about calculating what we call the multiplier. This is a situation where a particular plot or a particular farm might be near a market, which is clearly an advantage in terms of selling produce, might be near a railway station or a port. And these factors were taken into account in assessing the valuation. They also recorded information about the economic life and principal economic activities in various towns. So that's the valuation books. And now we move on to the Griffiths itself. Now, the Griffiths valuation is the most important census substitute that we have in Ireland. And I'm going to talk about what it is, why it's important, how to get the best out of it, and how to use its extensive search facilities to access the rich information sources it contains. And then we'll have a look at the valuation sheets themselves in the more detailed look section, and we look at how it was maintained in what are known as the revision books. And finally, we'll bring all those threads together to try and make an assessment of the value of the Griffiths valuation to family historians. So what was it? Well, it was a valuation of all land and property used as a basis for raising taxes to pay for local services. The intention was to apply a consistent method to the valuation. And that was done by assessing the quality of land on each plot across the country, to assess the productive capacity of land. And this was to be done by physical inspection, by actually not just boots on the ground, but spades in the soil to actually find out what the quality of this land was. So its location, whether it was on a slope, top of a hill, bottom of a valley, etc., all this would be taken into account. And the idea was to determine a rateable value for each parcel of land. And for buildings, a commercial rent that could be levied on an annual basis. And the two combined would be used to determine the amount of tax payable for the local rate and for the poor rate. So how was it done? Well, he used a standard method. There were extensive notes, and those notes are actually available here in the National Archives as well. The notes to the individual valuers, what to look for, how to do it, etc. The value of each plot of land was calculated. Fixed scale of prices was used to determine the value or its productive capacity. So it's a question of measuring, valuing, calculating, sketching in some cases, documenting, mapping and plotting every plot of land in the country. The results were arranged by townland within civil parish, usually within barony, certainly at the start. But why is it so important? Well, we've got to look at the context. It's important largely because of the poverty of the alternatives. And what I mean by that is the whole of 19th century, not a single census, well, some very few census records remain for the whole country. So broadly speaking, we have no census records of the 19th century. Civil registration started in 1864, which was quite late. And this was the only survey which showed where people lived, property they occupied, the construction of the houses, the value and the age of the property from the mid-19th century, which was in the middle of the famine period. Church records at the time were very patchy, as I mentioned. Many parishes hadn't started, many had been lost, others were very incomplete. And so that makes the Griffiths valuable because of the context in which we have it. But why is it so important? There are intrinsic merits. It was the only survey of households in the country from the mid-19th century, which is an important period of Irish history. It did list the names and addresses of the heads of households. And it's reckoned that something like 90% of heads of households were covered. It was underpinned by new and accurate boundary definitions, by quality ordnance survey maps, and supported by a series of valuation notebooks that we've just looked at. It also covered the whole country, all 32 counties. And the most exciting thing is that it was not a static snapshot of events, it was maintained. And this meant that the history of who occupied land could be traced right through from the Griffiths through to even as far as the 1970s. Now, let's remember what it was. It wasn't a census, so it doesn't list all the members of a household, their ages, where they were born, etc. It only records the owners and the primary lessors. In other words, if a huge landowner often gave responsibility for managing a part of his estate to a land agent, and the land agent then sublet various plots, the names of the people to whom it had been sublet would not be recorded. So there are limitations. This was particularly true in urban areas, where large blocks of poor quality tenement buildings were owned by people who then sublet them to others. The names of those families to whom they had subletted in densely populated urban areas were not recorded. So, where do we find it? You can look at it free at that particular website, which is the standard one for doing it. You'll find an icon when you go on it, Griffith's Valuation, click on it and you're in. So what would you find? Well, there are search facilities. We'll have a look at each of these. There's the valuation sheets themselves, which document the people by townland, We'll look at the maps that underpin the whole thing, and we'll look at other information that's stored in the databases, which are of use to family historians and social historians. So if you were to go on to the website, this is what you would find. This would greet you. This is the landing page. Across the middle, Griffith's names, Griffith's places. Those are a set of tabs which allow you to access rich resources within the Griffith's valuation database in the National Archives. The default position is for a name search, which we'll look at in a second. So let's look at the search. We'll look at a family name search, and we'll look at a place name search. So let's do a family name search. Let's look for Patrick Hart. I hope you can make this out on your screen, but Patrick Hart has been inserted into two boxes, step 1 and step 2. We don't know where he lived, so we just hit the search. We get a note at the top of the screen, which tells us that there are 153 Patrick Harts in the Griffith's valuation. Now, if we look at that picture there, there are just 8 results on that sheet. These were presented by county, so they're in alphabetical order by county, starting with Antrim, right down to the W's. Then shows the civil parish. In column 1, there are some details about the location, which we'll look at in a minute. And then in column 2 is the actual list, the actual valuation sheets that relate to that particular person, that include that particular person. And then finally, access to the maps is through the buttons in the 2 columns on the far right-hand side. So let's look at column 1. What does column 1 give us? Well, if we look at column 1, it just gives us information, basic information about that tenancy. The name of the tenant, Patrick Hart, that we're looking for. The landlord, who's the Reverend William O'Neill. It tells us where it is, the county, the barony, the union, the parish and the townland. And if it was in a town, it would then give us the street name, where it says place name, it would give us the street. And it might, in the rural areas, give us a sub-townland where it existed. At the bottom, it gives us some detail about the publication of the valuation. It's the age of the valuation, the currency of the valuation. And we can see that this particular one was 1862. Now, that's an important piece of information. So let's look at column 2. Now, column 2 is the actual valuation sheet. Now, this may seem a little bit complicated, but what we've got here under O and We is the townland. So it's listing all the people by plot number who were found in O and We. So it's going from plot 1 down to plot 14. And the Marquess of Sligo was the landowner for almost all of it. There was one which he sublet to an agent, as you can see lower there. So if you look at the very first column, where you can see 1, 2, 3, those are the plot numbers. They can be cross-referenced to the maps that we'll see later. So if you're looking, you can find the townland on the map, you look for plot 1, you know that plot 1 was occupied in 1862 or whenever it was by Thomas Joyce, and that he occupied a house. Offices were a euphemism for farm buildings. Any sort of farm building, a cow byre, a shed, a workshop was collectively known as office. The area of the land, and then the value, and then the value of the buildings, giving a total. And those were in old sterling currencies, pounds, shillings. So let's look at the second search, which is for places. Now, in this case, we're going to look for Loughlinstown. We don't know where Loughlinstown is, so we just put Loughlinstown in and search. And we find that there are 9 Loughlinstowns in Ireland. And those are printed on that sheet. So that if you know the county or the area, you might be able to narrow that down. And this information shows you the county, the barony, parish, townland. There are variations on Loughlinstown because it includes the Loughlinstown commons and so forth. The occupants, which is the valuation sheet that we saw a moment ago, that sort of sheet, is in that column. And then again, the map views of the 2 far right columns. That's essentially the place search. So let's look at the valuation sheets in a bit of detail. The Griffith's value was compiled between 1847 and 64. It was presented, published by Townland within Civil Parish, initially by Barony, then in later years by Poor Law Union. It shows the occupiers, heads of households, no other family members, the immediate lessors. And it describes what the tenement is, its area and its value. So what useful information is available? Well, all the landowners are recorded and how much land they own. It records the occupiers, tenants, and how much they leased. It lists the head of families by plot within each townland and the buildings that they use. It shows the value of those plots, and it has also lists and shows agnomens, which we'll talk about in a minute, which allow you to identify more accurately who that individual was. It's like a name suffix to distinguish between, say, different cousins that might bear a similar name. A quick word on terminology. Tenement was defined as a taxable property, a building or land that had been held by a person for over a year. Parcels of land could be subdivided into plots, and on the valuation sheets, those are labelled in uppercase letters, A, B, and C, etc. Whereas buildings, such as houses, outbuildings, were indicated by lower case letters. 1 or 2 terms that you might see when you look at a Griffith valuation, I've recorded there. Probably the most important are in fee, which means that the person had absolute legal ownership of that plot of land. And if there was a death and they were still going through a wills or a probate system, then they might show representatives of somebody. Right, let's look at the valuation sheet in a bit. As I've said, this particular one shows in the small townland, there's only 6 plots and there's a graveyard. Now, we're showing in the first column the actual plot numbers, and these are the ones that we'll see on the maps in a minute. And then on the right-hand side, a little A indicating a house. So the first 3 plots, 1, 2, and 3, also include a house, whereas the others don't. The graveyard has some kind of building. Then it shows us the townland, Carrackeel, the landholders, name, landowner, or the immediate lessor, in this case the Marquis of Sligo, who owned nearly all of Mayo, parts of Galway and Sligo as well. The description of the tenement, the area of it in acres, roods, perches, and these are statute acres now. The rateable value, both of the land and the buildings, and then the total that was due, the total assessment that was payable per year. So in the case of the top one, £5, 10 shillings was due, mainly the land. So a bit more detail. Let's take the left-hand side first. So we've got 4 columns there. We just look at each one. The first column, the number and the letter. The number refers to the plot. The letters of reference refer to subplots or buildings. Column 2, townland, and then the list of occupiers. In column 3 is the immediate lessor, to whom the rateable value is paid. Typically, that was the landowner, but it could be an agent or an immediate lessor. A description of the tenement. And in the example we had before, we saw houses, offices, and land, some with land only, and we had a graveyard. The graveyard, of course, was exempt from the charge. So if we go on to the right-hand side, we've got 4 columns there as well. And this is where the area and its value are introduced. So we've got the area in acres, roods, and perches, the statute acres, as we mentioned, valuation of the land in pounds, shillings, and pence. Same for the buildings, and then the total of column 6 and column 7 give us column 8, which is the total annual valuation of that property. That is the rate that was payable. So putting it all together, we get back to the Carrickeel and the small townland with a total of 87 acres and the total rateable value of £55.14. Now, I mentioned agnomens. I've just picked out a townland where there are 5 agnomens on 5 plots. And what we've got here, you will notice on plot 2, there are 2 John Gallaghers. One's a senior, and the other, J&O, is a fiddler. Now, I'm assuming that the fiddling is of a musical variety rather than anything else. But clearly, living on plot 2 in a single house is a father and his son. So those values are brought together for those 2 people. Value of the land, value of the buildings. There were some outbuildings, obviously, and the total. But what we've also got is 3 Michael Gallaghers. We've got one at 3A, and in brackets, Phelim after it. We've got 4A with Tom after it, and we've got 5C with Ned after it. Now, this is likely to be 3 cousins. And the idea of putting Phelim, Tom, and Ned after the same name is to show that these are 3 different people and to identify the particular family line that they come from. In general, in terms of the caveats, it covered 90% of the rural population, about 50% of urban population, mainly because of the problems of subletting, dividing large blocks of flats and tenements, and those secondary tenants were not recorded. And then third...
Michael, sorry, just to let you know, it's 10 to 7, but there's no rush.
Okay. Maps and valuations don't synchronize, which can be very frustrating when you're trying to tie up a particular plot. You've got plot 5 and you look at the map and you've not got any plot 5, you've got a plot 5A, 5B, 5C and 5D. And the reason for that is that they are from different dates. The valuations were done in the early 1860s generally. The maps themselves are usually 10 or maybe 20 years later. So the changes between the original Griffith's valuation and the first set of maps that were published doesn't include changes that were made. So you've just got to be aware of it. Right, so we're going to now look at the third component of the Griffith's valuation, which is the maps itself. So we've got a series of maps. They went hand in hand, that initiative on the boundary survey. And this was done, as I mentioned before, the boundary survey defined the boundaries of townlands and civil parishes. They handed it over to the mapping agency. the Ordnance Survey, they produced the maps, and they then went to the valuers. So a set of good quality maps underpins the whole of the Griffiths valuation. And it defines the boundaries of civil parishes and town. It defines plots within each town. And these are cross-referenced to the valuation. And I've mentioned the imperfect correspondence due to time difference. So, where do we find the maps? Well, you'll find them in 3 places. You'll find them on Ask About Ireland, which is the website I mentioned before for generally accessing Griffiths. These use a set of later maps, and they show version numbers, but they have good images in colour. Maps are also available, more contemporary maps, but generally in black and white with poor images, on behind paywalls at Find My Past and Ancestry. What are the main features? Well, you can access several versions, so you can go back and look at what's changed. It also allows you to look at individual town maps by creating a database underneath supporting Griffiths valuation, where details of townland maps are stored, and by popping an icon on top of the map, you can then drill down into those street maps. Similarly, for information, historic information about townlands, icons, name books are also available to drill down for more information about particular towns. The maps themselves are zoomable and printable, and there's a clever sliding feature that allows you to transition from the historic map, which is the default position, to a contemporary Google. Now that's useful if you're looking for a particular townland that you want, you found the townland on Griffiths map, and you say, how do I find this in the countryside? By going to a Google map, you may see a motorway, you may see a main road, you may see something you recognize, and say, right, I know where that is. And then you can look at a satellite image if you want to. So looking at the maps in detail, the top left-hand side of the map is the toggle between map and satellite image. On the right-hand side is the slider that goes default position historical map, moves all the way to the left to Google map or any position in between. You've got the map versions, and then you've got the towns database, which is a simple hide towns button, which is a toggle. Its default position is off, so you have to press it to show all the images across the map, and we'll look at that in a minute. And similarly for the name books, which is the information about towns. So let's look at a map. I hope this isn't too complicated. It's rather full, rather full picture. What you've got here are almost all of 2 townlands. They're identified by the thick red line, and the name is written right across the middle. So we've got Clonrusk Little top, and we've got Clonrusk Big at the bottom. There's a blue rectangle in the top townland, and it shows you the total acreage of that town, 110 acres and a bit. And the one below, Big, is, as you would expect, has got more acres, 150 acres. That's useful information. Now, the circle, and this may be difficult to pick out, there are some lowercase letters, A and B, in plot 10. And what that is saying, that in plot 10, there are 2 properties, 2 houses, and you can see a road coming in from the left, from the northwest, if you like, into plot 10, so that these houses are situated on a road. They're labeled 10A and 10B, so you'd expect to see that on the valuation sheet. And then finally, plot 3 has been divided into 4 subplots, which are curiously spread across this town. So you've got a 3A and a 3B, 3C and a 3D as well. So it's worth studying that particular slide to try and understand how to use and get the best benefit out of the maps. Now, I mentioned the town's icon and the street plans. If you were to hit the button, which was marked hide towns, and the default position of that was off, touch that, then you will see all these little icons around. And this is County Dublin, and I've just highlighted one just to show you what sort of information you might expect underneath. I've just picked on Clontarf, which is part of North Dublin. And if you look at what's available, it's the street plan, part of the street plan of Clontarf. So if you're researching a family that lived in Clontarf, inside the Griffiths, not only the map of that part of Dublin, but also a more detailed street plan, which is showing individual properties, roads, church, and so forth. So that can be a very useful feature. If we look at the other one, the name books, this is where we're drilling down into townlands to find out more information. Now, this is out in West Mayo, and a surprising number of documents are available for townlands in a fairly remote and depopulated area. We just pick one of them, Bunkergower. We then find some printed sheets which give us information about that particular civil parish or townland. And he's telling us how the name of the townland came about, prominent families in the area, quality of the land, the neighbouring townlands, places of interest, such as Argyll's got a famous round tower and so forth, and the history, a little bit of history about the townland. So it's a bit of background, useful background information for family and social historians. And then what else makes up the Griffiths value? Well, the last one thing I wanted to look at, information resources, which we've already looked at part of them. We've looked at households through the valuation lists. We've looked at places through the maps and access to them. Name books, we've looked at directories. Included in the Griffiths valuation database are a series of directories known as the Tom's directory. The full proper name was the Almanac, Irish Almanac and Official Directory, known more colloquially as the Tom's directories. These came out in 1844, and I think they were continued to be published right up until the 1960s. And these contained information about civic leaders, about gentry, nobility, religious orders and churches, about prominent merchants and traders and businesses that were operating in the town. And they're available. And often they're quite extensive and have quite a lot of names in there, so that if you're tracing an ancestor who was a jeweler or a butcher, you might well find more information about him or her in these Tom's directories. So, covered on this, we've covered the tithe, the early valuations, which are townland based, and we've been through the Griffiths and the primary valuation. And the point I did make before was that these were maintained. And they're maintained in a series of revision books. So, what happened here was when changes were made, changes to land occupation, which could be an amalgamation of two plots together to form a new one, a subdivision of a plot, new buildings, new houses, new farmhouses, demolitions, or significantly from a family historian point of view, a change of leaseholder, that was an important sign for family historians because it indicated usually death, a marriage, or emigration. And this information is recorded and maintained in the valuation office in Dublin. Changes were dated. Valuers and surveyors came around probably about once every 2 years. and they put a date in the right-hand column. And to my amazement, they were very clever, and they used a system of coloured inks to delineate the year. They put the year down, but to emphasize the year, if the year ended in a 1 or a 6, they used red ink. 2 or a 7, they used blue ink. 4 or a 9, green ink, and so on. Now, over time, those changes would start to clog up the book, and after about 10 years or so, so many changes have been made that the document itself is becoming unusable. So what they would do is they would simply translate the latest position into an entirely new book and then start to maintain that. And that's how the name and cancel the first book. So that the new second book, that became the master. When that was full, they then moved on to a third. So that's why they're sometimes referred to as cancel books, but the official proper name is revision books. And so if you were searching somebody from the Griffith's valuation to the present time, you might expect to go through maybe 10, if that family had continued through the generations up to that point. You will also see statements with LAP on them. Now, this was where land was under the new Irish Free State. Land was purchased by tenants whose families had worked that land for hundreds of years. And a system of loans was introduced, substituted for rent, so that people were paying back a financial loan to gain ownership of their family land. They'd be marked LAP. This is now landowner under the Land Act purchase scheme. Again, all these are held at the Valuation Office, and they're an invaluable aid to the history of the occupation of land for nearly 125 years. They're only available by personal visit, although most of them are digitized. You can only go online actually in the Valuation Office. However, if you're looking at a northern county, those records are digitized and available online through the ProNe website. So what's the value? Bringing all this together, final slide, what's the value to family historians? Well, I've tried to show you what the Griffith's valuation is, its importance, how to access it and what information it contains, and hopefully how to get the best out of it. The importance of the Griffiths, as I mentioned before, is the poverty of the alternatives. There were no census records, church records were patchy, irregular, discontinuous, civil registrations started late. But it does identify the principal landowners and landholders. Something like 90% of the heads of household are recorded. It's searchable by name and location. And for social historians, it provides a unique survey of living conditions from the mid-19th century. Who lived where, the land they held, soil they worked, houses they lived in, how they were constructed, the quality and the age of them, and some of the outbuildings and farm buildings that they used. And it's all underpinned by excellent mapping. So I hope that's been useful to you, and I'm happy to take some questions from you. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very, very much for that. If I could ask you perhaps just to stop sharing there, please, and we can get the Q&A on the road. So thank you very, very much. To nobody's surprise, the Q&A box is absolutely jammed with questions. So I'm just conscious of the talk that you have given, and we'll run with a couple of questions, and you can let me know if there's any more that you are happy to answer. So one of the first questions was just asking about, what does in fee mean?
In fee was a term which was used to delineate land that was fully legally owned by the individual whose name was against it. And typically It goes back to Cromwellian times when the Crown rewarded supporters, free, and also Cromwell did that as well, with large tracts of land and took it away from the native Irish people. And they, in law, that land was granted to them by the Crown. And that's why they had inalienable rights to that land. So that's what in fee.
Thank you. A question here about the tabs, the Tithe Applotment books. When names are crossed out and new ones entered on the occupiers list, does that indicate a change in the occupiers of this particular plot of land?
Yes. And that's how that's the only way you know there's been a change. There's a crossing out, a new name is introduced, and then in the far right-hand column is a date. So you know when it happened. The crossings out and the date are in these coloured inks that I mentioned. So you can identify which particular crossing out they're referring to. Because over time, you might get 2 or 3 crossings out, 2 or 3 dates, and it's not always easy to reconcile what's in the far right column with what's in the far left column.
Thank you. Another tabs query. My family lived in a townland owned by the Church of Ireland rector. So it was glebe land.
Yes.
And there is no listing for the townland in the books. It's named, but it's left blank. So this person is wondering, would his family have paid a tithe, or would it be recorded somewhere else?
If it was glebe land, then it was owned by the church, and often there were local arrangements whereby the church gave certain pieces of land near to the church building itself or the presbytery to various families, often prominent people of the parish, and they might do in return for that, instead of a rent, they might do work in the church and look after the graveyard or the physical building. So there may have been private local arrangements for that family. It's probably worth going through the revision books, because at some point the church was disestablished, and therefore land such as that may well have gone into the public domain.
Okay, thank you for such a detailed response. This is an interesting one. Was there a minimum age that a farmer had to be to work or rent land? I know it's a little bit left field, but maybe you have the answer to that.
I don't have the answer to that, no. To be quite honest, I feel
That's okay.
21 is a sort of age, because that was the age at which people were treated as adults in the legal system, but don't know the precise answer.
There is a question here that I can answer myself as to whether the Tithe Applotment books are available to view in the National Archives. They are, and they're also on our website. And I actually tweeted the link to the valuation records a little bit earlier, and I can include it in a tweet in a couple of minutes. Is there any place one can find the people who worked for the occupiers, for example, farmhands, stable boys, and so on? Is that likely to be possibly in maybe estate records perhaps, but would there be anything included in the likes of the records you've described?
No, that wouldn't, but you're quite right. Estate records, these, we mentioned a Marquis of Sligo during my talk. They own vast tracts of Mayos and parts of Sligo and Galway. Now their home was Westport House in Westport. They did when the family finally gave up. They bequeathed all the records of the estate to the state, and those records of what Westport House are available in the National Library, and they contain lists of tenants from different parts of their estate. So that is very definite. I've looked at these myself, and these are very definite, similar information to what we've covered tonight. List of names, the townland will be mentioned, and possibly the amount of land that they actually leased from the owners. So that's the place to go. Some, very few, actually list, if you like, the employees and what they did and so forth. But that is not always the case. Not always the case.
No, but we would have rich records also with rental books where details are given of the lessors or those renting land from the landowners or the lessors. Quite a few questions in the Q&A box here asking about whether there's a handout available or will this talk be made available online afterwards. We don't have a handout, but the talk is being recorded and it will be made available on our website, hopefully tomorrow. We will flag it on our website and we'll also flag it on Twitter. So please do keep an eye out for that, and obviously do follow or retweet it. We would like to get news about Michael's wonderful talk out to as many people as possible. As I mentioned earlier, almost 600 people had registered for it, and a little over 300 people have tuned in from all over the world. So for those who have been tuning in at early hours or very late hours around the world, your dedication is very impressive. Thank you very much. Just maybe one or two final questions, Michael, because I'm sure you're pretty tired after such an absorbing presentation. Right. Okay. Could you explain why part of a townland's name recorded in the tabs would have disappeared by the time Griffith's valuation was taken? He gives an example here. Part of a townland was historically named after my paternal surname, and the surname is Ralston or Rolston, R-O-L-S-T-O-N. But this was no longer recorded by the time Griffith came along. So you're talking about, what, about 25 years later or so, with tabs running from 1823 to 1837, and Griffith's coming along 1847 to 1864. So it's quite a short time period between those two valuations, Michael. So would it be usual for names to have disappeared between one set of valuations and another?
No, it wouldn't have been usual. Townland names, as I mentioned, there are often several names for particular townlands. And usually there was the old Irish name, then there's an anglicised version of that, and then something entirely different. These are often traceable through a website called Logain ME, L-O-G-A-I-N, I think it's M-E, which...
Logain, A-I-N-N, yep.
And that allows you to trace how names changed over several centuries, which is very useful because names did change. Now, other things happened. That's very, very occasionally. Townlands were merged, there were changes made to the boundary, but that was very rare because these townlands go back to Anglo-Norman times and they're very traditional, people like to mess with. So it might be worthwhile looking at that particular website. And you may find why it's changed, when it changed. That might help.
There's a comment here, absolutely superb presentation. Pity this wasn't available to me when undertaking the BA in local studies in Maynooth University. I have a strong feeling, Michael, that your talk is going to be very well subscribed and referred to by lecturers as a go-to place for top quality information on the Tithe Applotment records and so on. You really explained the different sets of records brilliantly, and certainly demystified certain aspects of it for myself, certainly, and possibly for other people too. So I don't think there are plenty of other questions, but some of them are quite detailed. But the majority of them are quite rightly praising and thanking you very, very much for such a wonderful presentation. And obviously I'd like to give the thanks of myself and the National Archives for a really, really wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Just one or two other quick things. Again, thank you to our audience for tuning in from all over the world. Tonight we had 55 comments in the Q&A box, so it was hard to pick out or to give equal time to all of them. So for those we weren't able to run through, I am sorry for that. As regards our next public talk, it will be taking place on Tuesday, the 21st of March, and will feature Dr. Michael Kennedy speaking on the direction that Irish foreign policy took in the late 1960s. And this is on foot of the new GIFP Volume 13, Documents on Irish Foreign Policy series. So please do keep an eye on our Twitter account and website over the coming weeks for further information and for further booking details. But in the meantime, I would like to thank you all very much for participating in tonight's talk. I wish you all a lovely evening, and Mila Buikas and Ihawa from Dublin. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.